realize that this is a fairly critical night in terms of Olympic competition, and we promise to be home in time to watch the highlights of the U.S.-Argentina basketball game. But before that, we have a lot of ground to cover here. Mr. Mayor, we're especially grateful to you for joining us. And as Tom mentioned, we've had the privilege of having you on campus quite a bit over your time in office. Before we get started with the questions, I want to tell our other guests here about a visit that you made to a class that I teach last spring. In addition to courses in politics and communications, I teach a course here in leadership. And the mayor came and spoke to the class. And he certainly talked about the tremendous successes that the city of Los Angeles has enjoyed over the last 7 years in terms of education reform, environmental protection, certainly public safety, transportation, and job creation, as we'll talk about tonight. What was especially compelling about the mayor's visit is he talked not only about his successes, but he talked about his challenges as well, and how important it is, and he made it very clear to our students that everybody, no matter how successful, faces challenges over the course of their life and the course of their career. And that the key to success is not to avoid those challenges, but to overcome them. And for anyone who may have seen the story that appeared in the LA Times the next day, I'll tell you exactly what Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa told our students about what happens when you get knocked down. He said, you wipe the blood off your knees, and you stand back up again, and you get back in the game. And I would say over the course of the semester, our students had the great privilege of hearing from leaders, not just from politics, but from business, from nonprofits, from communications. And on the final exam, that one sentence, Mr. Mayor, showed up more than showed up more than any other. So lots of USC students with bloody knees, thanks to you. Tom Sales introduced our guest, and I will tell you, I've watched Antonio Villaraigosa's career from his time as a community organizer and labor leader to a member and then the Speaker of the State Assembly, to a member of the City Council, and of course is Mayor of Los Angeles. And we don't have nearly enough time tonight to cover what he's accomplished over the course of that career. So I'm going to start out tonight, Mr. Mayor, by focusing on a couple of items very close to home. We're going to talk about the city of Los Angeles writ large in just a moment. But you're a guest here at the University of Southern California. So the first two questions, you can answer either or both, are both about USC. Number one, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. Tom mentioned it. Hearing your thoughts a little bit about the USC master plan and what it means to the surrounding area in Los Angeles. And second, I'd like you to predict exactly what the final score will be by which the USC football team defeats UCLA this fall when they play in football.
First of all, let me thank Tom for being here. And he did mention, in addition to being a senior vice president with the university, is also the president of our Department of Water and Power Commission, and done an incredible job at moving us from one of the dirtiest public utilities to one that's now reached the 20% renewable goal, conserving 19 times the energy that we used to, and on our way to get out of coal. So I want to thank Tom Sales, and let me thank you, because what he didn't say, we've known each other, we've worked together, we've also been on the other side of one another. And I've had the greatest respect for you, Dan, and I'll tell you one thing I've said many times about the Pete Wilson team. They were loyal and strong and worked across the aisle in a way, and I know that if Pete were here, he'd say that we worked together. Largest school bond in U.S. history. Healthy families, largest expansion of health care since Medi-Cal. And so it's good to be here with you, and good to be here at SE, because I was at Cal State LA 2 weeks ago with your contemporary and soulmate, I know, Raphael Sunshine, and I said, thank you for having me here at Cal State LA at the Jesse Unruh Institute. And I could have died. It was the Pat Brown Institute, of course, a great institute at Cal State LA.
But I'm sure Raphael took it as a great compliment. So
He took it. Can't tell you how he took it, but I had mud on my face and I had to take it off for a bit, but it is great to be here at SC. And let me talk about the master plan for a moment. You know, I tell people what I love about SC, not just that my daughter's here, but and that I have a honorary doctorate here, but SC is a great institution, a world-class institution of higher learning that sees itself, its destiny is tied to our city. And they're not only the largest employer, they're making investments in the city every single day. I mean, when you think about an anchor tenant for the city with an economy, a world economy focused on intellectual capital, having an SC here, a Caltech, a UCLA is so important. And this master plan is important because it's going to create jobs, but also because it's going to make investments that are going to pay long-term dividends. And we're happy to get behind it as we have, and excited about the prospects of what it'll mean to really adding great value to the city. And then the second question was?
Would USC USC Oregon?
That was a question that I know that you asked to be cute and funny. And one thing about me, everybody, I love SC and I love UCLA, but I am a Bruin, so I root for the home team, except when this home team is playing against somebody else. So not to be one of those politicians that just kind of goes on both sides. I hope UCLA wins at everything they play against USC. But when SC, I've changed over the years. Now I'm for SC when they play against the world. It's pretty good.
I'll take that. We'll take that.
UCLA is going to win the basketball game this year.
No argument there. Mr. Mayor, we'll come back then to the USC-Oregon game in just a moment. But in the meantime, we're going to talk a lot about the laws that you've changed, the regulations that you've changed in order to encourage job creation and economic growth in Los Angeles. But one of the things I learned from your former deputy mayor, Austin Buettner, who co-taught a class here with me last year, and his successor, Matt Karatz, who's
doing a tremendous job, by the way.
Absolutely, absolutely. What I learned from both of them is that laws matter, regulations matter, but when you're looking to bring jobs to a city, particularly a city like this one, attitude matters.
I was going to say that same word. Attitude matters. You know, saying to people, we want you here matters. Working to do the small things and the big things to welcome job creation and businesses to come to the city. And I think for too long, Dan, and probably because we're so big, we just pretty much had an attitude, and that's been true for probably the last 40 years or so, 50 years. You know, this is LA. You got to be here. So what can you do for me? Instead of taking, you know, a more entrepreneurial, more problem-solving, more welcoming attitude, as you said, and obviously making it easier in other ways for business to come here. And we've kind of have been forced by this recession, the worst since the Depression, to be more entrepreneurial, to be more welcoming, to you know, you talked about Matt and his team. They call, I guess, five cold calls a week. They got to call a company and say, hey, what can we do for you? What do you need? How can we better serve your company? Now we've done a number of things, as you know. We've cut the gross receipts tax, which in the region is among the highest in the region. We had a business tax holiday for the last 3 years, and we're trying to get through the council an extension of that for another 3 years. We've cut the internet tax, and as a result, we've created Silicon Beach in Venice and Playa Vista, that area. You know, Google has come to LA, Yahoo, a number of high-tech companies coming to that part of the city. We've created a case management system that says, instead of you hiring some big-time lobbyists to help you get through the system. What about we do that work? And when there's a problem and a conflict between the different agencies of the city, what about we make it our problem to solve that conflict? And I think whether it's Restaurant Express, cut from 18 months to 6, still too long, by the way, Mr. Carrots. Cut 18 months to 6, the amount of time it takes to establish a restaurant. We went, for the foodies here, LA was probably a top 8, 7, 9, 10 city with great restaurants. We're now like number 2. Still not number 1, I won't say who is. But in no small part because we made it easier for these guys to come here, to open up a restaurant, to bring people here, the sales tax that's generated from all of that. So we've created, we had and Matt will help me, but I think we lost 50 dealerships.
We've lost, actually, we're only at 52. We've lost over 100 dealers in the last 25 years, auto dealers.
100 auto dealers. And so now what we've said is we're going to make it easier. We're going to reduce the gross receipts tax on an auto dealer because they generate more sales tax than the gross receipts tax that they pay. And we had lost 100 of them over a period of time. So we've done a lot of stuff, but we still got to do a lot more. And some of the things that we're doing is, as you probably know, we've passed the half-penny sales tax, generating over 30 years, $40 billion, creating about 500,000 jobs. We've, for the first time since 1984, we're modernizing the airport to the tune of about $4 billion, creating 40,000 jobs. At the port, where we move 44% of all the seaborne goods, we're investing between 1.2 and 1.5 billion, 20,000 jobs. So we're really focused across the board. Job creation, cutting red tape, making it easier to create businesses in this town. And that's why SC's master plan development is so important. Every little thing we could do to create jobs in this town, we got to do it.
Well, I'm really glad in particular that you mentioned the ports and that you mentioned the airport. Because one of the things that we talk about here, the class that Austin helped teach last year and that Matt is coming to this fall, is a class called The Future of California. And what we found is that for students to develop solutions to the state's policy challenges in the future, they have to understand the state's history. And what they will learn when they read about California's history, and in particular the history of Los Angeles, it's how its unique geographic location provides economic opportunity. And I'm wondering if you can talk about Los Angeles's place as what we call the capital of the Pacific Rim, and what is being done and what can be done going forward to maximize those opportunities with the rest of the Pacific Rim.
I think it was Steve Sample that first talked about LA being the capital of the Pacific Rim. I've talked about LA as being the Venice of the 21st century. It is to the United States and the world what New York was in the 20th century and London in the 19th. This is the future. If you take a snapshot of LA, take that snapshot and take a hard look, because LA is what North Dakota and Iowa and New Hampshire and the rest of America is going to look like. We have a unique geographic opportunity, but also a demographic one. The geographic one is that we are poised with a gateway to the growing economies, the fastest growing economies in the world, in Asia, China, Korea, Singapore, India, Japan, and you name it, Vietnam. And then the growing markets and growing economies, Brazil and Mexico and Chile and Colombia. And because we're so diverse, 140 countries, 200 and some odd languages, 37 nationalities that have their largest population here. Our port complex moves 44% of all the seaborne goods. Our airport is the largest, second largest destination airport in the United States, top 5 in the world. Just in the last year, 6 new nonstop international flights. So that you understand the meaning of that, each international nonstop daily flight generates $623 million to the LA economy. We did 6 of them. Only JFK, I think they did 6 or 7 as well. But ours are coming from Asia. So geographically and demographically, we're poised. And then the last thing is, and I'm very proud of that, and we should all be proud of that, I tell people, LA doesn't care who your father was. In my case, they didn't care that I didn't have one. With Judge Walker's decision, they don't care that you had 2 of them. LA just says, just do it. They did. I mean, LA says, just do it. I mean, you know, we don't care. And that's a beautiful thing, because that openness, that, you know, that, I mean, we're 42% foreign born, so everybody's brand new. You're from Kentucky, and before that, wherever you were, I think. People don't care. You know, when he first got hired, and I'm talking about the head of our LA Chamber of Commerce, when Gary first got here, people said, well, he's from Kentucky. And I said, well, and? What with Kentucky and LA? I mean, like, LA doesn't care. So all of those things, I think, create this great opportunity for us. It's not just geographic, it's not just the weather, it's not just, it's the people, it's the demographics, it's this attitude that we just say, just do it.
So what I hear you saying, and actually before I go on, I should make it clear to the people watching this on television that the mayor does not know the hometown of everyone in the audience tonight. He just happened to recognize Gary Tobin, the head of the Los Angeles Chamber, and knows that he's from Kentucky. We were going to turn up the lights and have him guess everybody else.
But that's the beauty of LA. We don't care where they come from.
But what I hear you saying, and to me this is a really important point, is there's an ongoing conversation about the cultural benefits of demographic diversity. What I hear you talking about are even more tangible economic benefits that diversity brings as well.
I tell people, I was at a breakfast 4 weeks ago, Korean business people, with Latino business people that we put together, my office helped to put together, looking at opportunities to invest in Korea and Mexico. We should be thinking about that kind of opportunities in Africa, in other parts of Asia, in Europe. LA is the city where the world comes together. Taking advantage of that, our great universities, the technology transfer that comes with intellectual and institutions of higher learning like this, all are things that we ought to be leveraging, and we are.
Let me move the conversation a little bit from economic issues to another issue that has an important economic component, that being transportation. Yesterday, as I read in the newspaper this morning, the LA County supervisors agreed to put your proposed Measure R extension on the ballot this November. They seem to do so without a great deal of enthusiasm. And there are, not only on the board but elsewhere, skeptics, who ask why you would want to move forward with a tax extension that's already so many years off in the future. We certainly want to talk in a moment about LA's transportation needs and the progress you've made. But is a tax that would be extended so many years out, is that smart fiscal planning?
I think it's a lot like what we did during the Depression. If you talk to 85% of the economists, they'll tell you we need to live within our means, make adjustments in pensions and entitlements that keep us on a more sustainable path, but we also need to make investments. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we have a $2.2 trillion need in terms of infrastructure investment. And you mentioned, you know, that they weren't real excited about this. Well, the fact is, if you recall, Gary certainly does, there were a lot of people that weren't excited when we put Measure R on the ballot in the first place. And despite their opposition, 67% of the people in this town voted for it in the middle of a recession. It will create 500,000 jobs, just the public transit portion alone, over a 30-year period of time. And what happened early on is almost from the first month or two, people walked up to me and said, hey, I passed that Measure R of yours. Is it still on? They said, where's your subway? And I said, that was a half-penny sales tax, ma'am. Not a 10-cent sales tax. It's over 30 years of time. It's going to take 30 years to build 12 public transportation lines to make the investments that we need. But it actually gave me an idea. And that idea was just crystallized and passed on a bipartisan basis with the Surface Transportation Bill, and that's called America Fast Forward. And what it said was, at a time of high deficits and debt, cities and states are going to have to do more of the infrastructure investments that we need. So we're willing to put up our money. Let's loan against the future and accelerate our infrastructure projects now. Well, we thought it would fail. And we were going at it, as I always do, as if we're going to win, but we always knew that it could fail. And so we got the loan program, not the bond program that we wanted. And so we're extending Measure R from extending the tax that would have ended in 2039 and 2069 so we could bond against the future and create 400,000 jobs in a 10-year period of time, not just doubling the size of the rail system, but investing in infrastructure investment on our highways as well. So why am I doing it? Because there aren't a lot of options in a recession like this. We've got to make this investments, stimulate the economy, create the jobs that we need, move more people, you know, improve the air, and do it kind of on our own at a time when the federal government is at a standstill and they're not doing much of anything. So, you know, it's kind of a self-help measure, if you will. And, you know, to all the people against everything, Dan, you and I have been around a while. And I have a lot of respect. I took on Pete, as you know, on 187 and 209, but also respected that he took on his party and raised taxes when we had to. And I'm not looking to be popular right now. I'm not looking to please everybody. I'm doing what I think is right. And I know that extending Measure R right now in this recession, at a time when there's a public will to make these kinds of investments, is what we got to do. And I'll let the naysayers and the, you know, the Monday morning quarterbacks do what they're going to do, and we're moving forward.
Just to follow up on that quickly, because when a lot of people think about transportation issues, you think of matters of convenience, quality of life issues. Think, oh my gosh, if I got on the 405 at the wrong time, I can actually grade papers on my way to USC in the morning. But
no, you're not going to grade papers on the 405. You got to drive. You're going to grade papers if you can go on a light rail line from Van Nuys underneath the 405. That's how you're going to do it, baby.
So, well played, sir. So here's my question, because you touched on it briefly, but I think it deserves another minute or two. We think about traffic, most people think about traffic in terms of convenience, quality of life, commuting time. But you said it's not just a matter of ease, but there's a very important economic growth component here too.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if you can talk about that for another minute.
Well, just accelerating Measure R is 400,000 jobs. We won't accelerate every project, but you know, accelerating the projects with the extension that I just mentioned will create 400,000 jobs in a 10-year period of time, at a time when the construction industry has an unemployment rate of upwards of 30%, and at a time when I think we'd all agree we're not making the investments we need in our infrastructure. So it's important for job creation, obviously improving our air quality, congestion. In the end, we got to stop finger pointing and start doing things. And I think I was with the mayor of Rome today at Getty House, and we were talking about when we first met at Copenhagen, and I was joking with him because I said, you know, at Copenhagen, Copenhagen was the follow-up to Kyoto, and I said at Copenhagen, all the national leaders of our governments were elbowing each other to see who could do the least around climate change. They were pointing fingers. I've done my part, you need to do yours. We were elbowing each other too, to see who could do the most. We were challenging each other. We were replicating the best practices of global cities around the world. And I think cities are very different than the state and the state capitals and the federal government, the Beltway. And so in a lot of ways, what we're doing with Measure R, we're not the only ones doing this. Chicago's got a $7 billion fund that they're putting together to invest in infrastructure. Atlanta is moving ahead. Around the country, you're seeing mayors really say, I'm tired of politics in the state capital. I'm tired of waiting on Washington. We're moving ahead. And that's what we're doing here.
One thing that I know mayors, at least in California, are generally not all too happy about is the governor and the legislature's decision to close down the redevelopment agencies that have been
an absolute abomination. And
care to elaborate?
Yeah. You know, I mean, at a time of a recession that we haven't seen, almost a depression we haven't seen since the 1930s. And in fact, you almost have to call it a depression because there's been nothing like this since the 1930s. Maybe it's not a depression to the scale and scope of the 1930s, but it's certainly the worst recession in, what, 80, 90 years. It's an abomination because they didn't put anything in its place. They basically balanced their budget on the backs of cities. And in the case of LA, denied us, the year before they eliminated the CRA, we created 19,000 jobs. But importantly, where did we create them? We created them downtown, in Hollywood, in South LA. We created them in the parts of the city that you can't bring business to unless you provide some incentives. The housing, you know, it was a tool that we used to be able to bring properties together and to do affordable housing. So my problem with what they did was they didn't put anything in its place. Since then, we've just passed a city, we're moving on to create an economic development agency, nonprofit, a public-private partnership, whereby we can, an economic development tool for the city that will have some of the powers of the CRA. But that elimination was more than just taking our money. It was taking tools that we needed to create jobs and housing.
Now, in fairness, though, there were certainly excesses in the program. The
and we
golf
told
courses,
them that.
the rest of it. Is there was there a way to fix the problems without eliminating the whole
We actually,
program?
the cities, I organized the top 10 mayors around the country. We acknowledged And it actually wasn't as many of the big cities, though there were a couple of them. It was a lot of the smaller cities that had really kind of abused this, you know, kind of used that money for things other than blight and the rest, and poverty. But when you look at Fresno, LA, there's a number of cities, not just those, I need to go through all of them, where we were mostly doing good things. And we actually said to them, in the areas that you think, and we're willing to work with you, that we need to make changes, we're willing to do that. They just completely eliminated everything. And that, I think that's the problem with Sacramento right now. It's broken, and it clearly, they don't respond much to the needs of cities. And you know, I mean, they essentially, the difference between a city, a state, and the federal government is when there's a budget crisis, the federal government just makes more money. States shift the burden to cities, school districts, and counties. We actually have to live within our means, and that's a different situation than what they have to do, but it is what it is.
You talked a little bit earlier about Pete Wilson taking on members of his own party on some issues years ago. Clearly this redevelopment issue is one that divides members of both parties. There's another issue in particular that has a very important economic component on which you've taken on a very important component of the Democratic Party here, and that's on the issue of education reform. And you know, you're somebody who came out of labor, who organized before running for office.
I actually work for the teachers union.
Taking on the teachers union had to be a difficult decision.
Yeah, it was, but I've said that the issue of education is the economic issue of our time. If we're not competing in developing the intellectual capital that drives the new economy, then we're going to be left behind. It's a democratic issue of our time. If you can't read and write, if you don't understand the issues before us in our democracy, you can't participate in an intelligent and meaningful way. It's a civil rights issue of our time when you look at the achievement gap. You know, Latinos are 50% of the city, and they're dropping out like flies. I mean, you know, have the highest dropout rate. If you took Latinos and African Americans, they're the biggest reason why we're 1 million down in 2025 in terms of the number of college graduates that we need in the state. And it's, according to Stanley McChrystal, it's the national security issue of our time for all of those three reasons. So I've taken on, I tell people that I don't believe the teachers union is the biggest problem. I think we're all part of the problem. We're 47th, 48th in per pupil spending. If we don't pass the tax increase, we'll be behind Mississippi. We'll be 50th in per pupil spending. If we don't make investments in our schools, we're not going to make it. But we also need to change, and we need to reform, and we need to innovate, and we need to have choices for families and parents. And so I take on what's broken, and I think they're not the biggest problem, but they're the most powerful defenders of a broken system. So I take on whoever I think is wrong, and I've taken them on. I mean, look, everybody, you all have heard about Miramonte, right? What if I told you that after Miramonte, you know, where sexual predators were violating and abusing our children, that we did a bill that said, we'll make it easier to dismiss people that are pedophiles or sell drugs to kids. Not take drugs on their own, sell drugs to kids. Couldn't get it up. of the legislature. CTA stopped it. That system's broken. And I say that as someone who's still very much in favor of collective bargaining and unions and very respectful of the job that teachers have. They got the toughest job. There's any teachers here? Yeah. They got the toughest job there is. It's a tough job. And the vast majority that go into that job do it because they want to change the world. But we've got a broken system when you can't challenge what's broken.
And let me follow up on that. Not too long ago, one of your successors as Assembly Speaker, Fabian Nunez, and the then governor.
I got a smile on my face. I love him.
And then the then governor, my new colleague, Professor Schwarzenegger, the two.
Professor Schwarzenegger?
He is trading his cigars for a pipe even as we speak. They commissioned a series of studies called Getting Down to Facts on Education Reform. And the studies made the points that you just did. Number one, that if California is going to make serious efforts to improve the quality of its K-12 education system, it needs to spend significantly more money on our public schools.
Yes.
It also said that if the money would be spent, that additional money would be spent in the same way that it is currently being spent.
You're
It
right.
would take $1 trillion more simply to bring California up to the national average. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that both Republicans and Democrats would like to see a well-educated future generations. Talk a little bit about the systemic breakdown that forces the two parties into those kind of corners.
Yeah, and I challenged you talked about challenging the left. I challenged the right too. Mm-hmm. I mean, this notion that we can make it on being at the bottom in per pupil spending. It's horse manure. It is not reflective of the real world. The fact is, we ought to be leading the world in making our investments per capita, but we also ought to be leading the world in innovation, in choice, in really challenging ourselves to be more metrics driven in terms of success. So I tell people, I think the radical middle to move the country and the state forward is to tie money to success and to challenge. I mean, I think that's what President Obama's tried to do with Race to the Top. It doesn't have to exactly look like that, but I think what we need to do in a state where we're in this, battle that's not moved us forward. We've got to say, let's make investments, let's tie it to success, let's focus particularly on the lowest performing schools, and then let's create a paradigm of incentives across the board to meet the challenges that we have, because we don't just want to compete with the rest of the country. We want to compete with the rest of the world. You know, when Tom Friedman talks about the world is flat in his book, with all respect to the young people here at SCA, UCLA, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, he's not saying that poor kids are not competing. He's saying the best and the brightest in America are not competing in math and science. I think, what are we, 26 in math or something like that? So we've got to create a system in this Golden State that doesn't just try to be the best in the country. We want to be the best in the world. And that's going to take innovation, focusing on best practices, tying money to success. But money is going to be part of the solution.
Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, who you referenced earlier, is pushing a plan that would extend the school day for Chicago school children. Is that something that you think would make a
We need to extend the school day. We need to have Saturday schools. We need to increase the time the kids are in a classroom. We need to have blended learning. We need to have blended learning. We need to have after-school programs. We need to incentivize and support teacher training and teacher development. We need to hold principals accountable. A lot of talk, by the way, I mentioned teachers. It starts with a leader. And the school principals drive change and success. We got to hold principals accountable. I mean, I understand that teachers have a union. I don't have an issue with that. Think about principals and administrators in LU. It's unionized from the top to the bottom. And these are managers. They have to have a lot more in the way of accountability than they do today. And they don't. So it's got to be teachers, it's got to be principals, and it's got to be all of us. You know, this notion, and I've tried to fight this over the last 7 years, that just because I don't have direct control over the schools, that education shouldn't be in my portfolio, because I should be dealing with potholes and all those other things, which I should deal with. I mean, if we're not dealing with education, think about this. A great neighborhood has as its anchor tenant, when you're buying a home, those of you who are in the position to buy a home, what's the first thing you look for? What kind of schools? What are the API scores at that school? Well, if that's true for a great neighborhood, why wouldn't that be true for a great city? We've got to make our schools in this state and in this city the best anywhere. We're a long way from that, but that's got to be our goal. And for all of the, I call them the naysayers, I won't say who they are, that say we shouldn't be bold and that we shouldn't set high goals, that's what you do when all you do is write on Monday morning about what people do on the weekend. We have got to set high goals. We have got to challenge ourselves. We got to say that we're better than that.
In addition to my own questions, several members of the audience have been good enough to give me cards with questions that they want to ask.
They're right there.
I'll pick which ones.
You'll pick which one.
But what I want to do is I just want to get a quick time check. Billy, how are we doing here?
Oh, we're good.
Okay.
We started late.
The mayor's not going anywhere. Get comfortable, people. First question. Why doesn't Los Angeles have a professional football team? What's it going to take to close the deal?
USC.
They are a professional football team. I mean, they're so good.
Nice save.
I was saying that isn't nice. Look, you know, for the last 7 years, actually before that, when I was in the speakership, tried to get a football team, and I was intimately involved in those efforts. And you know, the NFL leveraged LA. Houston got the team, and they'll say they didn't, but I think they'll acknowledge that for the longest time, they've taken advantage of the fact that we've said, look, the taxpayers of this town want a football team, but we're not building a stadium and funding it with public funds. So I think we finally got beyond that. I've reached out, I've had a relationship with Paul Tagliabue, with Roger Goodell, with Carmen Policy, with you know, a number of the owners in the NFL, and I think we always knew that the predicate after the effort in the 90s, that the predicate for getting a football team was getting a collective bargaining agreement and getting that TV contract. They needed to kind of settle the finances of everything. I think they're ready. I know we're ready. We'll be finished with the EIR in September, early September. I think the game will be on. And I think we're going to get a football team. But, you know, we all got to acknowledge that we want this marriage. You know, for the longest time we were saying we don't need the NFL, and the NFL was saying they don't need LA. I think we both acknowledge we'd like to get married now. So it's, you know, I tell people when you got that much money, and I didn't have any notion of that. These guys are hard bargainers, all of them. But I think in the end, we're going to get a football team. I'd like it to be before I leave, but we'll see. I expect that it will be.
Okay. Just as a follow-up, without taking sides in the two bids that are being forwarded for a stadium, the agreement that was forged over the Farmers Field site, to me, is a relatively rare example of warring factions being able to come together toward a common goal. I'm wondering if you can talk about how you get the job-creating community and the environmental community to work together and not view each other with as much mutual suspicion, not just on football stadiums, but more generally.
Well, I think the environmental community, one, is acknowledge that the political leadership in LA is very committed to improving our air quality, to expanding public transit, to addressing our carbon footprint. This administration has done more in the last 7 years than we did in the, probably in, I won't say 30, I know 15, and probably 30. I think there was a trust level with them. I think we also set a high standard, and we're going to have a lot of the people that will attend these games are going to come on public transit. And I think also there's just an acknowledgement that it's time that all of this conflict-driven processes that we've had in this town and in this state really don't work for anybody. So I think a lot of the environmental leaders wanted to make it work, and that's what we did. And I know the business leaders and the policymakers felt the same way. And so I've always believed that if you're talking and working and trying to solve a problem, you almost always will. So I think that's what happened here. It was a confluence of stakeholders that wanted to make it work.
And setting aside the football stadium as a specific example for just a second, I have a question also here about the continued revitalization of downtown Los Angeles. Downtown LA, I think most people would agree, is virtually unrecognizable compared to what it was 7 years ago. And I saw a study recently, which gets back to your earlier point about diversity, that the downtown population of Los Angeles is precisely 25% African American, 25% Latino and Latina, 25% Asian American, 25% Caucasian. I don't think I want to know exactly how you pulled that off.
I do.
But more generally speaking, what are the next steps? What else needs to be done to continue the revitalization of downtown?
Well, I mean, I tell you something. Again, I mean, I'll be really honest with y'all. If I was just looking at, I mean, if you remember when we did the Convention Center Hotel, all the controversy that was created, the Monday morning quarterbacking, the criticism. If I was worried about all of that, we would have done nothing to develop downtown. We moved ahead, just as we're moving ahead on Farmers Field, just as we're moving ahead on the USC master plan. That's the problem with this town. For the longest time, we listened to the people who on Monday, evaluate the man in the ring or the woman in the ring, and we're moving ahead. And I think there's an attitude in the city of right now, in Hollywood, because downtown's not the only place. Yeah. Go to Hollywood. The average tourist would go to Hollywood and stay there for 23 minutes. And now they stay there for, I think, 2 days, overnight. They stay overnight. I think there's just an attitude of, let's move this ahead. Now, that doesn't mean you don't take into account community input, questions about governmental contributions to a project and all of that stuff. I think what it means is that you evaluate that, you take it all into account, and you move ahead. And that's what I think we've been doing in LA. We got a great city council, by the way, and I know that there aren't any council members here, but I like reading about how we don't fight enough. I mean, like, hello? You look at Washington and Sacramento, and that's all they do. So there's there's a lot more in the way of collaboration here. I don't think that's a bad thing. They don't agree with everything I do. I don't agree with everything they do. But there's a lot more symmetry of priorities and the like that I think has helped us to kind of move ahead. I mean, labor and business, they battle, but they also work together fairly well in a lot of areas. And I think increasingly that's true with environmentalists as well. I mean, we've been able to create an opportunity for everybody to weigh in, and then we make decisions.
Mr. Mayor, my last question. Your staff warned me that you are not prepared tonight to make an announcement about what you will do after leaving the mayor's office, and I've seen you talk about how you might enjoy the challenge of being governor someday. There's no shortage of other speculation. And so I won't ask you what your next job is going to be. What I'll do instead is some of the older people in the audience may remember is years and years ago, Barbara Walters made her name as an interviewer by asking her interviewer subject, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? So, Mr. Mayor, I will ask you instead, if you were an Obama cabinet secretary, what kind of cabinet secretary would you be?
I was about to answer, I'd be an oak tree. You know, look, thank you for asking that question, because I'm going to talk a little bit about President Obama and why it's important to get him reelected. I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to work really hard to get him reelected, but I'm not looking for a job, and I'll be real clear on that. And my staff doesn't like me to say that because they want me to keep my future open, but with all respect to them, I make those decisions. I want to work hard to get him reelected because I think the country needs him right now, and I think we need to continue moving forward in the way that we have in the toughest economic times. I do believe that for me, after being mayor 7 years, and it'll be 8 on June 30th at 11:59 and 59 seconds, and all of these, a number of these people, not all of these, only a few of you work for me, but a number of you will be there working with me. I think it's time to reflect. And I'll tell you what I want to reflect on, Dan. Two of us have been involved a long time. I think it's broken on the right, and I think it's broken on the left. I think it's more broken on the right because no, I don't mean that because I'm more on the other side. I think it just is. I haven't read his book yet, but I've read a lot of commentary about Norm Ornstein's book where he talks about how broken it is on the right. He comes from the American Enterprise Institute, fairly conservative guy, I mean, moderate conservative guy. I want to spend some time reflecting and writing and speaking. I want to enjoy my family a little bit. You know, I'm 59, I'll be 60 in January, and I want to spend a little time kind of thinking through how we create a space for what I call the radical middle. A middle that moves us forward, a middle that takes the best from the right and the left and gets this country moving again and gets people believing in how great this place is. There's a lot of cynicism right now. There's, I mean, you see it in our voting patterns and whatever. And I'm still a believer. I'm 59, but you know, I'm like a kid on a college campus, and I still believe that you can make a difference. But I recognize that a lot of people don't anymore. And I want to figure out how we get them to see that we really live in a great country, and it's great because we're involved in it. And if we lose hope and lose this sense that we have to be involved to make it work, then we'll lose the essence of what America's all about. we won't be the beacon of light and hope to the world that we've been for, you know, a couple hundred years. So that's what I'm working on.
I'll put that down as Secretary of Defense. Supreme Court Justice Villaraigosa.
Oh, yeah. That'll work.
I think that's, all joking aside, I think that's a tremendous note on which to close off this phase of tonight's conversation. Before we thank the mayor for joining us here tonight, I want to take a moment to thank the people on his team who made this possible. Teddy Davis, Vicky Curry, Barb Solish, Matt Carrots, and their teams. Guys, thank you very, very much.
That handsome, bald-headed guy over there, Peter Sanders, as well.
Oh, I don't want to thank Sanders. I also want to thank the folks here at USC, Tom and Jackie and David Galaviz, and the team at the Unruh Institute, Kirsten Olson, Chui Win, Andrena Hidalgo, and Laura Hill for putting all of tonight's program together. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thanks to the team at Channel 36 for making it possible for all of the Angelinos who were not able to be here with us in person to have the benefit of hearing the mayor's conversation. And finally, thank you, Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, for joining us here this evening. This concludes the official and the televised portion of tonight's program. However, for those of you who may have 10 minutes more to spare, we have a rule at the Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC in that we do no programming here unless it includes students not only as audience members, but as participants. And so I'm about to give up my seat, and Daniel Rothberg, who is one of the editors of the Daily Trojan, is going to come up here, join the mayor, and conduct a brief interview. For those of you who would like to stay for that, I will tell you, Daniel is one of the best journalists in the greater Los Angeles area, student or otherwise, and I think you will benefit from hearing his questions and watching the mayor squirm as he tries to answer them.
I'm squirming. I didn't realize that this was going to be, I thought it was going to be done in some classroom, but, you know, well, it is what it is. Stay for this young man for 10 minutes, come on. Ask your questions quickly. You know. I love the Daily Trojan, by the way.
Thanks.
See, I'm trying to be nice. I'm ingratiating myself.
Do you care if I...
Okay, yeah. Bring it over here.
What? Okay. Well, my first question is obviously going to be about a tree.
Your first question is what?
Isn't going to be about a tree,
Yeah.
if you were a tree.
Making fun of his professor.
No, Dan actually stole my first question because I'm going to ask you about the master plan, but I'm going to ask you a similar sort of question. There's been sort of a lot of talk with the master plan, which is still sort of a pending thing. It's going to go before the Planning and Land Use Management Committee soon. And then also the Coliseum lease, which is also pending with the state agency. So my first question, and there's a lot of talk about how it's going to affect the community. And I guess my first question for you is sort of, how do you see those two things affecting the community? Do you sort of see them as being beneficial to the community?
Yes.
Or
Answer is yes. I think they'll be both, on both counts, beneficial to this community. I think it's very clear that the Coliseum Commission has squandered a great asset, and I believe that SC would be a better steward. I think we have to drive a tough deal that benefits the city, the state, the county, and the surrounding community, and I think that will and happen. With respect to the master plan, you know, I've said, hey, look, we've got to mitigate the impacts on the surrounding community. We've got to ensure that there are community benefits associated with it, but I think it's a net plus, plus, plus on both counts.
Okay. And sort of similarly, in maybe looking ahead, because those are two kind of very big projects. How do you see, what do you sort of see as USC's role in the community in the future years?
Well, when you speak about the community,
in the city's sort of development.
well, look, and I want you to say this about SC, because I'm here. When you look at SC, UCLA, Caltech, these are three institutions of higher learning that are among the best in the world. They're critical to LA's positioning as the capital of the Pacific Rim, as the city of America's hope and promise. By the way, that's not to discount at all the private colleges, whether it's Loyola Marymount or Occidental or Claremont or the CSUs, who also add great value. I mean, I think more engineers graduate from the CSU, more teachers than any of those three institutions. So I think they're very critical to the future of the town. And it's why I said that what I love about SC, they see their destiny as tied to our city. And that's important. And that's why I work overtime to make things work for SC, because I think it overall is a added plus and a benefit to the city.
Cool. So now just sort of more a generic student-related question still, though.
Generic student-related question.
So I guess not so generic. There are elections coming up in the next few months. There's state elections, local elections, presidential election. What do you think is the biggest issue facing students right now? And I guess specifically students in LA. So maybe what's the biggest local issue that's facing students?
High tuition rates. I think it's in America's best interest to make college affordable. I mean, look, if public schools are the great equalizer and in a global economy increasingly reliant on information and intellectual capital, we need to be graduating more people, particularly in the sciences and math, but making it possible for people who are poor, who are in the middle class, to be able to get the best education they can. Give the best and the brightest the opportunity to reach for the stars. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge. And it's not just, and it's the most important, not just for those students, I think it's the most important challenge for the nation. That's why I said it's the economic, democratic, civil rights, and national security issue of our time.
I'm not used to doing interviews with applause. I'm in print journalism. So that's interesting, high tuition rates. What do you think are some possible ways to sort of fix that or curb that trend?
We got to make investments. I mean, I think there are a number of other things. I'm not an expert there. I think we got to find efficiencies. I think we got to, I mean, I know that a number of our universities are moving more and more to using technology. I think that's important, and we should welcome those innovations. I think obviously robust student loans and grants are important. You know, when people ask me how I got here, I always tell them I can read and write, and I got here because I dropped out, but then graduated from high school, went to a community college, and went to UCLA on an affirmative action program, and now I'm here. And I think creating a pathway for these young people is very important. It's why I supported and support the DREAM Act. You know, what people don't understand about these kids, what people don't understand, and I said that today to, I think, interview on Newsweek. I said, let's say you don't care about human rights and civil rights. Say you don't care about solving this conundrum and the challenge of immigration reform. What about the economic consequences of bringing these kids from out of the dark into the light? A $1.5 trillion infusion into the U.S. economy. That's what giving them an education will do. That's what letting them out of the dark and into the light. So it's a great thing, and you know, I think education is the most important thing we could be doing right now.
Well, Dan also stole my last question for you. One of the things I was going to ask you about football too, but I did want to ask you, and I know this is sort of a more serious question to end on, but it's definitely something that's on the minds of students here at USC. And I know your administration has made public safety one of your priorities. And in light of the tragic shootings last April, I was wondering sort of, do you feel that the neighborhood around USC is safe?
Well, it's actually safer than any time in the last 20 years. But we shouldn't rest on that. We got to make it safer still. And I'll tell you something, I think your university, and particularly your president, Max Nikias, is absolutely committed to doing everything he can to make it safer still, as we are. You know, I mean, you got to understand, when I got word of that tragedy, I was awake in the middle of the night. I have a daughter here. It was personal, but if I didn't have a daughter here, it was the kind of thing that, you know, tore at the heartstrings of people wherever you live, or no matter whether or not you have a child there. And I think this university is absolutely committed to keeping this neighborhood and this university community as safe as possible, and so are we. And that's why we're collaborating and working together. But, you know, we got to always make sure that we're doing everything possible to keep this great jewel of a community and great jewel of a university a place where people feel safe. And that's our goal, and that's our priority. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Let's give both Daniel and the mayor one more round of applause.